Well, thanks, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon to those who might be watching on the East Coast or in Europe, since this is being webcast in partnership with our partners at Passcode. I'm Jeremy Grant, Managing Director of the Chertoff Group, as the big voice just said. Our second session today is entitled Identity as the Great Enabler. So in the last few years, we've seen identity move from being the red-headed stepchild of security. Apologies to anybody who's red-headed or a stepchild. But move from being something that really has been out on the outskirts to something that has been central to any company's digital strategy. The confluence of mobile and cloud adoption, combined with the porousness of a lot of traditional perimeter defenses, has made clear that an identity-centric approach to security is something that's quite critical for dealing with modern threats, both to the enterprise as well as for consumer-facing applications. It's a point that's been underscored by a constant barrage of major breaches, think OPM, Anthem, Target, Sony, where stolen credentials provided the attack vector, as well as some others like the IRS's Get My Transcript breach about a year ago and the NSA's Snowden breach, where weaknesses in other aspects of identity solutions were the attack vector that enabled the system to be compromised. But when it comes to identity, it's not just about security. So our session today will explore how identity done right is a fundamental building block for any CEO and CISO, allowing organizations to not only better secure their systems, but also look to identity strategically as a tool to help streamline processes and enable more user-friendly online experiences for employees, partners, and customers. Now, identity has not always been upfront in this role, and one of the things we want to look at today a little bit is the evolution of identity as a segment and a profession over the years. A good friend of mine, Ian Glazer, former Burton Group and Gartner analyst who's now Director of Identity at Salesforce, wanted to be here today, but he's moderating a panel that I'm on with him in New York tomorrow. He noted in a blog a few weeks ago, identity is a missing leg of the security and privacy stool. But he pointed out identity professionals are often a second-class member of that security and privacy conversation and started to explore why is that. So what he put forth was a suggestion that people in the identity industry never really expected identity to be a lasting thing. First, it looked like it would get absorbed into human resource management systems, later CRM. Still another phase of the industry, it looked like it might just become part of systems management. It's really only recently the industry is really starting to emerge as its own critical segment that stands on its own, which is essential to both managing cyber risk as well as enhancing customer experiences. So to talk about that evolution, I'm thrilled to have a great panel today. Rather than say who you are, if I can ask each of you to introduce yourself and give a few opening remarks to kick off the discussion.
Sure. Hi, I'm Joe Gottlieb. I lead corporate development for SailPoint. We're a market leader in the identity and access management world. As I like to describe that to others, what that really means is we help large enterprises get and stay very thorough about who has access to what. So literally locking down what people are allowed to access in terms of their privileges, entitlements, the depth of their access, and then managing that entire complexity across the large enterprise. If you can imagine this, right? That's very complex. Think of all the systems, all the logins, all the levels of entitlements across various users, various groups, various projects, how transient that is. And sitting in this seat, just to hear you talk about it, Jeremy, I can see how we are indeed behind as an industry. We talked about it earlier. Security's behind, business wants to go faster. Our growth and our opportunity is all about helping these companies actually get more thorough about this. It just hasn't been done. For the $75 billion or so that gets spent on all the other parts of security each year, we have necessary but insufficient protections in network security, system security, et cetera. So in this world that's shifted from trust but verify to distrust and monitor, getting to these last line of defenses and the most critical lines of defenses on like encryption and exactly who has access to what becomes really, really central to improving our infrastructure in terms of security given the attack vectors that are out there.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Chen-Si Wang. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Twistlock. We are a security startup here in San Francisco in the area of Docker security and container security, which is a fairly new infrastructure concept. One of the things we do is access control, which goes back to the concept of identity. But myself, background, I've spent many years at Forrester Research as a principal analyst and VP of research. I covered many security products and security market, including identity management at one point, also privacy. Before that, early on in my career, I was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I I did research in applied crypto. So all this discussion about encryption and master key is really interesting to me from both my research background and also the industry experience I've had so far. I also ran a panel actually at RSA this year on FBI versus encryption, and we had Matthew Green, which was one of the authors of Key Under the Doormat, with Peter back there as well as a co-author, and he had a really interesting view on as a technologist. We also had an ex-general counsel of FBI on the panel who brought really interesting perspective as well. So a little bit later, connected to identity, I'll speak. But I'm very happy to be here today to talk about what I see as a industry person who has been in this business for a long time about the evolution of identity and privacy.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm Scott Howd. I'm the SVP and CISO of MGM Resorts International. And so to clarify that a little bit, it's not just the MGM Grand on the Strip. We're 10 of the properties on the Las Vegas Strip. We have multiple properties in Macau, some properties in Michigan, Maryland, and Massachusetts. So for us, identity has become paramount to enhancing the customer experience. So I think you've seen other companies really embrace it, like Disney, where it becomes an enabler for customer enjoyment, and that's really what we're looking to do with it at our properties as well. So, you know, it used to be that everybody spent all their time at the gaming tables, so that was where about 70 to 80% of our revenue came from, and now we've kind of flipped the equation. About 37% of our revenue comes from gaming, and the rest comes from entertainment, restaurants, you know, customer experience. So it's a topic that I think, to your earlier point, I always hated identity. It was always a thing that I never wanted to deal with, right? And now it's an everyday conversation with me, and it's become very important to what we do.
Hi folks, I'm Sam Srinivas. I'm a product management director for cloud security and privacy at Google. My team works in infrastructure security and privacy, and also is responsible for our internal security and privacy. And we work very closely, almost as an extension of our central identity team, and we drive the roadmap for strong authentication, and also in re-architecting how our employee access management works and how it ties to identity.
Thanks. Well, let's jump into the questions. I'll start with Chengzi. You've got a pretty unique view of the sector. You've been both an industry analyst for years, you've been a professor, and then you've been in leadership roles in a number of companies. Wondered if you could sort of touch on all of those experiences to help give the audience a bit of a view on how you've seen the role of identity evolve since you first got into the space.
I think identity is now a really different game. As Scott said, it's about customer experience, and customer experience ultimately drives revenue, right? So the reason that we see a lot more spotlight on identity is because it's an economic argument now. In the past, nobody knows what you're doing. Identity management, it's like back office function. Now, I buy anything online. Somebody has that record, somebody tracks it. I like shoes. The same pair of shoes that I visited on one website follows me from this website to another, right? Somebody's keeping track of it. I live in Silicon Valley. I drive a car with an IP address and a big 17-inch monitor. A story that I tell is I actually bought my current house on my car. I'm not kidding you, that's a true story. I was driving to the airport with my husband, and I got a call from my agent said, well, you got to sign the offer today, now, actually with an up in the offer value in order to get this house. We're in the car, right, driving to the airport. And I was like, okay, send me over DocuSign. On the 17-inch monitor in my car, I signed the document, probably over a vulnerable SSL, right, to the server. I bought the house. Now, I'm a security person. I thought about it. I'm like, is that a smart thing to do? Well, if I didn't do it, I'd lose the house. I can't take that risk, so I did it. Now, think about it. Somebody keeps track of that, right? Probably more than that server knows that I bought the house on the car. And more than one thing I could do on the web browser in my car, right? Consider this scenario that IP addresses, cars are outfitted with more and more IP addresses now, right? How many of you drive on 101 or 280 here? Right? You drive on 101, you see the billboards, right? The ads of billboards are the old model of ads, right? So nobody knows what kind of return on investment is because you print this big thing. Consider this becomes a digitally dynamic ad, right? And consider the IP address of the cars and the identity of the person who's driving gets forwarded to the server on the ad, billboard ad. And they'll say, hey, the next 50 cars coming, 60% of these people interested in product X. Let's put up an ad dynamically on product X. That'll increase the return on investment, right? So that's why identity and the data on identity is so important today because it's an economic argument. So that's my first.
Thanks. So let me pivot down to Sam to talk a little bit about the security side, because I think Google's been doing what I think is one of the most interesting efforts in enterprise cybersecurity the last few years, fundamentally re-architecting its approach with a concept that's been dubbed the Encore. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you guys are doing there and the returns you're seeing.
Yeah. We were maybe 4 years ago in a fairly conventional setup where you had, when you were accessing resources, you came over a VPN or you were inside the corporate network, and then some layers of security to access more important resources would be maybe a production network or servers and so forth. And more and more we felt that we should have a more integrated view, that it didn't make sense to have any particular trust in the internal network. And so we moved to a model progressively where every access we have a direct conversation with the user and the device, and we make a dynamic decision as to whether the access should be allowed. So let me be a little bit more specific. If you're a Google employee, we have obviously thousands of internal applications. You know, you might be, well, other than HR, there might be some, you might be a network engineer looking at a report, you're an ads employee looking at some dashboard or whatever. All of them are on the web, and that web looks to the employee as if it's on the internet. You just type the URL and off it goes. But we make it transparent where we actually allow access only from managed machines, which we have an agent and we understand what the state is. We're able to identify the machine strongly. And so when we make a decision as to allow access or not, we can make it on the full spectrum of who it is, what group they belong to, what kind of machine is it, has it been patched, where is it, and things along these lines. And we have a central access management engine which makes its decisions. So we do allow you to access stuff from your home machine. You can log in, but you'll get to see only some things. Other things you'll see like a polite page which says, sorry, you can't do this. And so that is sort of there isn't like a VPN or anything that you do. You use any device, you try to access something, you'll get, if it's the cafe menu, you're probably going to get it from pretty much any device. Going beyond just the web, also our internal, if you have a workstation inside Google and you're accessing whatever, SSHing to stuff and so on, we follow the same principle. As it comes onto the network, we understand the status of the device, and usually going through a proxy which has information about the managed state of your device and makes that as part of the decision to where you go. All of this typically is invisible to the end user. I mean, if you are an engineer doing an SSH or an employee accessing an internal web page, it just seems to happen to work anywhere, so to speak, but the plumbing is doing this below. So end-to-end security, obviously, which all of us get with SSL and SSH and so on, but the management of the client and checking its status and making an access decision in real time when you allow access. That's and we call it beyond corp. Basically, it's sort of a slightly internal thing. We call it a corp network, which is what we used to call our internal LAN. And so now we're going beyond that. We don't really care that much whether you are being in the office, just a signal, but we are. It's not give you any extra special privileges.
And so what happens to the traditional corporate network that you used to maintain with that?
It does very much exist. I mean, it's not as if when you come into the Google office, we just put you on a corporate network. We do obviously have a guest network separation and so on. And we keep all the older layers. They always do add some value, but their relative importance to us is much less. So we're not that concerned about, someone inserting and plugging into your network in some secret device somewhere, and it's not going to get very much. So we keep the layers, but they always add value. We reduce noise, things like that.
So let me shift over here to Joe. So building off leveraging identity as a pillar of security, in some cases as an alternative to some traditional network defense measures. SailPoint's a pure play firm in the identity space. You guys have had stellar growth the last few years. Obviously, you got some good product there, but is there a larger macro theme that you're seeing that's starting to turn people towards the importance of identity?
Yeah, first I'd like to address the Encore concept. I love the concept. But basically Google is the new chef in a very cool kitchen, right? Really leading by example, showing how with network security being insufficient and now taking the trouble and the time to think about every access, every scenario, every application, and to do contextual authentication, right? What will I ask of this person to prove who they are? To provide then access to these backend systems. So a great example of how we can, in a newer world, right? They don't have the same legacy systems to cope with that many large enterprises have, but at least within that world, showing how to be very, very thorough. And I think this is becoming more and more possible. And I think that's one of the drivers here, right? So one of them is the negative and one is the positive. The negative, of course, is the attack vector we know today, which is attackers come in, they typically use phishing, they come in, they move laterally, and they get access to accounts, and they misuse these credentials that are sitting there. If there are a lot of extra credentials sitting there, it's just easier for them to find them, right? If the credentials have more privileges than they should have relative to that user's role, it's just easier to exploit from that point forward. And so locking that stuff down is just a very, very necessary duty that we have now that we are managing this level of complexity. And that's not really new, it's just a matter of the fact that the defenses, it's now become very clear. We've done what we can at the perimeter. We've done what we can on individual systems. We're doing what we can on monitoring. We just got to get to the heart of the matter. On the flip side, the positive driver is this empowerment that was alluded to earlier, right? Business wants to go faster. I was just at the ServiceNow conference, and it was an interesting lens from which to view this whole issue because they've been very good in service management. They're now bringing the discipline of workflow and process management and contextual routing of change to a lot of other domains, including security. So one of their newest forays is into incident response, incident management. And I think they'll bring some very interesting pieces to that puzzle. The other thing they're doing is they're doing more thorough onboarding. So how many here have had a really positive experience the last 3 times they've joined a new company? Anyone? Anyone? So onboarding is not typically very effective, and as we've added more digital tools to our tool set that we employ as individuals in the company, helping them be competitive, we haven't kept pace with getting them available immediately, getting only the right ones available immediately without hassle, without issue, just as quickly as you're told to go, where to sit. Right? So that's the competitive angle of empowering people more immediately and more effectively, and then maintaining what they need access to in terms of the tool set becomes a key driver. Because if you can empower someone quickly, you can also shut them down quickly. The same infrastructure is required to do both. And so there's great leverage in turning on this enhanced service to then leverage this for enhanced vigilance in identity management.
Thanks. So let me actually pivot off of that to Scott, and also picking up the topic that Cheng Zi was talking about earlier. So we talked about onboarding new employees, but onboarding new customers or welcoming back existing customers is something that you've been focused quite a bit on. And I know we had a chance to talk a couple weeks ago. You mentioned that you might be the CSO, but you're not only working on information security, you've actually got a good partnership with the chief digital officer. How are you working together to leverage identity to enable better customer experiences?
Yeah, so I think I've been at MGM for about 3 or 4 months, and one of the problems that we have is 10 of the 25 largest hotels in the world are ours and sit on the Strip. So if any of you have had the joy of, I'm checking in for Black Hat or whatever, and you have the 3-mile long line to get 4,000 people checked in, it's not a real pleasurable experience, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do is, hey, wouldn't it be cool, like you're in the taxi and you check in and I take a picture of your ID and I prove that you're 21 and I send you the keys and you just walk to your room and Bluetooth it in, right? And so it's like, well, sounds kind of cool, but wow. now, and that was my first conversation with the audit committee as we were walking through this situation is like, for years I've been worried about credit cards flowing out or PII flowing out. And now, now we're in the life safety business, which I didn't know I was really getting into, but let's talk it through. And so we talked it through, and actually is we walked through the solutions like this would be harder to hack into than me just going up and giving a phony ID at the desk and getting in, or convincing, social engineering the person at the front desk. So it was actually a pretty cool solution. But then it's one of the other issues that we faced within our properties is once you got into our property, we got very possessive. And that takes revenue out of our pocket, because when somebody says, hey, I want to go to the sushi restaurant and it's all full, then they might end up going to a competitor and getting sushi there. So, and we were not very good about going, well, hey, you can, I'm staying at the Bellagio and Yellowtail is full, hey, but you can walk across a bridge and Tetsu's right there in Aria and I'll get your reservation. We would just say, don't you really want steak? I can put you in the steakhouse. That's good to go. And so the chief digital officer and I started talking through it. We had what every, I'd been in retail for a long time before this, and what every e-commerce site had that was built is, its username and a horribly hashed password that somebody made up the hash, thing for it, and that's what we dealt with. So, we partnered with Okta to kind of help us go through that, and now we have kind of a lightweight, extensible directory underneath, and we can add attributes about the customer as we go along, but it also gives us a platform to build into. So when we want to do mobile, okay, it's ready for that enablement. Hey, when I want to do fingerprints at the pool to pay, I can do that, right? It's extensible. And so it was funny because, at the last organization I was at, it seemed like it was always a death match between me and the chief digital officer. We would never come to terms with each other, right? And here it's like we're totally on board with each other and we're leveraging each other. And actually we were on stage together talking about how we partner. It's like, how weird is that I'm sitting with the chief digital officer, right? Because we're always, arch nemesis. So it's been a very good experience, and it's nice to, back to when you can actually have a conversation with the board of, yeah, I need your money over here to protect this, but oh, by the way, here's a project that we did and we think it boosted revenue this much. That's a very enabling conversation at the boardroom level.
And let me, following up on that, was that a relationship that's just sort of evolved naturally, or was this something that others above you helped drive?
It evolved naturally. I mean, we do have the luxury of proximity, so we sit very close to each other, but it was one of those things of, he called me and said, I'm trying to walk through this and I need some help on making sure it's secure. But then as we started kind of spitballing it, we came up with a lot of ideas of, wow, wouldn't it be cool if you did this? And wouldn't it be cool if you did this? And so we did. We went to the VP of e-commerce and said, the identity system that you have, it's out. We're going to put in one that we like and makes sense and is more nimble, and it got us to the place that we wanted to be.
Can I ask Scott a question? So how do you deal with I totally get the services you're providing. I think as a consumer, I would love it because it's less inconvenience for me, right? But how do you deal with the privacy part of keeping all these information? Yeah,
and so we have an interest, so because of where we are, right? Some people, we don't welcome people back and say, well, we really enjoyed the last time you were here, because we don't know who they were here with last time, right? So we try to keep that privacy selection very private, right? But some people want to opt into a knowledgeable experience. So I also have the privacy office, which is actually nice because I deal with legal, but I get to kind of overrule legal sometimes on some things. And so we've worked in conjunction with the privacy office as well to say, okay, people, if they want to opt out from these experiences, they can. If they want to be totally anonymous, they can. But, it is nice to be able to, the idea would be, hey, I check in the room, I register, I'm an MLife customer, which means I've wanted to accumulate points and get better experience experiences and all that. And so when I go to the pool, shouldn't it just be, we're not there yet, but I press my fingerprints and I paid for it at the pool, and I don't have to have my phone and I don't have to have my credit card to have a good experience, right? And so those are the type of things that are a little further out, but that's the type of stuff we're looking at.
I've got two takeaways already. One is making sure that we hook Scott up with Sean from NIST to talk about privacy risk management framework. And the second is making sure I call you next time I'm in Vegas to get a reservation. So
there you go.
Let me go back down to Sam. So we talked about the role that you're working on with Google's enterprise security, but I know you've also been really heavily involved in helping customers, both I think in Google's for Work offerings that a lot of people purchase, as well as everyday consumer accounts. You've been involved in helping them get access to strong identity tools they can use to better protect their accounts. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you've been trying to push forward there.
Yeah, I guess critical part of identity obviously is authentication. A person shows up again, how do they know they're the right person? And as was mentioned, phishing is a very severe problem. In fact, all of us see it. And in our case, in Google, people have varying sort of importance to a Google account. Many people might think it's just an account, but for some people it can literally mean life and death, because it might be a dissident or it might be a reputational problem. You are, in fact, some of you here are very senior people in the government or something, and your private account is an actual target. And so we've always been trying to figure out what to do about a phishing problem. And of course, we introduced OTPs for our, we were the first introducers to consumers. That takes it some way, but even that is targeted. And in fact, Europe, I think, has had OTPs for banking for a while. And if they really want to steal your money, they can steal it, and they do. And so fundamentally, it has to be a second factor. To be unphishable, you essentially have to have it cryptographic in some sense, and you have to have a proof that the second factor is where the access is. The minute you send a code or something which can be replayed from somewhere else, there can be a guy in the middle or whatever, it doesn't work. And so we were trying to see how we can get into a world where the device that you have basically can be strongly proving. So of course, you have to give maybe a password initially, but also the device, we know cryptographically it's with the person in a provable way, and there we truly have a strong re-authentication of you. And that's what took us into the FIDO Alliance. And I'd say I'll talk about like the ultimate dream, and then I'll talk about what we have right now, because it's going to be a journey. I guess the ultimate dream, ultimate vision is that people are going to have access from multiple devices, and every time they come to a brand new device they need to set up, they might have an old device which already which knows who they are. So my phone knows who I am, and I can re-authenticate to my phone by showing my fingerprint or looking at it or whatever. So when I come to the new device, I should be able to just tap it, and whatever, this phone should say, hey, do you want to transfer identity to that device or whatever? And then I just say yes on the original device, and next device lights up in a secure way. So you can think of it as like, device lighted up like a candle, and the new device, you can light up a new candle, and all of those are burning forever. And anytime you need a new device, you just use an old candle to light a new candle. Very rarely would you need the matches, which is like the first time identity proofing, like saying, I have nothing, show up and go to the passport office, how do I prove who I am, kind of thing. And that would be where we want to go. And it has to have standards, because the device here will have a Facebook account and be an Android device, and the device there will be Firefox running on a Windows machine, and all of the stuff has to work. And so that's where we wanted to go, and in FIDO we made a whole bunch of progress. There are multiple use cases which work, and the one thing which we've deployed at this point, and there are others in FIDO who have deployed other very interesting use cases. I'll talk about what Google has done, is that we drove a standard for we were focused very much on security here for a special bespoke device, which actually is essentially a smart card, but it's a consumer, it's a web authentication oriented smart card. So what you can do is you can insert it and using Google Chrome and very soon Google Firefox, log into a Google account, register it, self-register it. It essentially generates a key and gives it to our server. And next time when you want to log in on a brand new device, we'll say, please show us your device. You insert it, and very soon either press a button over Bluetooth or whatever, and we get a re-signature on the key, and it's a very standard concept. We log you in, it's just like a smart card. But there are complications, right? We have to be very, very wary about security. So let's say Facebook uses it and Google uses it. The two should not know they're talking to the same device. And the Facebook key should not be reusable from Google. So if website A, website B collude, and website A takes the keys, hey, you got it from, let me try it, it shouldn't work on the device. So all of these kind of things we had to think through in the alliance. And I think we have a pretty good story there. So today, if you use a Google account and you're truly concerned about security, you do have an option. You go to Amazon, you buy one of these devices, there are multiple vendors, and you can attach it to your Google account, and you're truly unfishably secure for whenever you use the device, that is. And we offer that obviously for Google for Work, which is just essentially, think of it as very simply Gmail for your enterprise. So we didn't have to do anything extra. It just, it's there. So I would say, to summarize, in that FIDO's tagline is simple, secure authentication, and authentication is a very key point to reproving identity. So the first time you go in to the DMV and you show whoever you are in some way, they give you a driver's license, from this point on, you're reproving identity, I guess, by going and showing a driver's license to people. Well, roughly the equivalent here, we want to make that reproving very strong. And we are sort of first way in our journey, and now we're working on how to bring this to mobile and so on and so forth. But you can use it today in a very specific context. It's not for the billions yet, it's for the millions, but we plan to get it to the billions. So it'll be transparently always there. It'll always work this way. Where people want to talk about going beyond passwords, it's going to be a long journey, but it will be, you might even now, the matches might be a password, like when you start up an account and maybe, or so on, but mostly you won't need them.
Thanks. So a two-part question for Joe. One on the SailPoint customer side, what kind of interest are you seeing around these kinds of solutions? And then beyond authentication, what do you see as the other key layers of the identity stack for clients to focus on?
So first on the authentication, we're big believers in authentication, but when you're in our world, you have to support everything that's out there. So it's in any given enterprise, they're going to have multiple authentication mechanisms typically, but certainly the diversity of solutions is very, very rich. And so it's all about adding that additional those factors and leveraging step-up. I think a really exciting trend these days is policy-based step-up and contextually based step-up, not only for the pre-connect, but even during post-connect. So if conditions change during a session, you want to be able to potentially intervene with a new authentication, perhaps with a stronger method. In terms of where we see this stuff going, I'd say 2 boring ones and 3 more interesting ones. So the 2 boring ones are just really being effective at having this workflow wash across your entire company and just being thorough about engaging business, managers, employees, the whole infrastructure in how these entitlements are managed. The other boring one is just coverage, all end systems, right? We're only as strong as our weakest link. If we have good policy controls around most of the systems, but then the ones where we don't have those policy controls, we're very, very vulnerable. So just coverage across all end systems is really, really key. So on the more interesting side, both structured and unstructured. So we're pretty good at nailing down access controls for the things we know, Oracle, SAP, etc. The new horizon is unstructured data. So now we need to look not just at who has access to what from an identity aggregated standpoint, so we can certify that, but then on a file side, this file, who owns it, who controls it, who should set the privileges, who else has access to it, is it part of a group that has a common policy, etc. So that whole unstructured world flips this thing on its head, and we have to be thorough about that. Another more interesting one would be opening identity context to security and opening policy engines to security, so that security policies that are being used for enforcement and monitoring can now be more identity aware. So if you're monitoring something in a SIM or a UBA, wouldn't it be nice to know exactly what that user has access to? So if they have indicators of compromise on their machine and you're seeing bad suspicious events, you want to prioritize those alerts that are involving people with lots of access, let's say privileged access. On the flip side, and in terms of enforcement, as we do more active response, wouldn't it be nice to alert this person's supervisor that they're accessing a sensitive resource from China at an odd hour, and just double check that they're traveling right now and that supervisor knows it, right? Otherwise, we've got a bit of a false positive and we may be disempowering that user. On the flip side, if we can't validate that, we want to start stepping up controls immediately, and maybe rather than bumping that person off a network, maybe we want to suspend the access to that particular sensitive system. some of these enforcement mechanisms in a much more elegant way. So instead of being very, very disruptive and removing all tools of the end user, perhaps removing access to the systems that count, or maybe all systems. That's the break glass version in the identity world. But I see these mechanisms becoming more robust as people get further along in their deployments of not only identity management, but in more active response on the security side.
So I'd like to make a request. On the identity management side, a lot of the conversations about proving who you are to the server, because server is trying to keep bad guys out. Sure, that's really important. I like to flip this equation on its head. I like to be able, the client, to be able to have some control of the server's behavior, as well as what is the server or the greater concept of service is doing with the information that we're leaving behind by using the service. I think that's a critical component of identity management that has not been brought up to sort of the forefront of the discussion. So for instance, I like to know, two pieces of information I like to know. I like to know whether the service, how long the service is keeping my behavior information, and what are they using? Are they sharing it with a third party? If they are sharing and making money, I should have a choice to say either you cannot share or I want a piece of the action. Do you guys know how much money Google makes per year on a registered user? How much? So my information is old. Several years ago, when I was an analyst, we looked into it. They make $100 a year on a registered user. All right, so they have tons of users, right? Now it may be more or less, I don't know. But if they're making $100 on me, I'd like to have a piece of the action. And I have no way of doing it today. So what I like to do with identity management, now you guys do enterprise, so it's a little bit, it's different. For consumer, I like to have a whole spectrum of choices that are available, from completely anonymous access, leaving no digital breadcrumb whatsoever, to the completely open end of the spectrum where I'm giving you all the information, but I need to have a piece of action. I like to have all these spectrum of choices available, and like to be transparent. I like to be something that's offered upfront to the user so I can choose, and I like to be verifiable. So I like the industry to work on that.
So let me actually jump back down to Scott, because that's, as you're looking at how to create different digital experiences, and sometimes it sounds like I might want to be recognized in Vegas, and sometimes I don't want anybody to know that I've been in Vegas. Are you looking at ways to sort of enable, through an opt-in experience, different parts of the spectrum, and maybe I get a free chip or something if or a priority reservation if I share more information?
Well, that does happen naturally. So, our loyalty program, and by its tiers and all that, you get rewarded. So the more you identify yourself at a restaurant or a club or whatever, you get higher level of service. I think it is interesting, the concept of okay, so where does that data flow though after it gets into my systems? We pretty jealously guard it because certainly we don't want you to go across the street and go somewhere else, right? And so we don't get a whole lot of benefit out of sharing it. But I think in other retail spaces and stuff like that, it does become more of a challenge. But I think, it does become interesting when you take that data, and the more they give you, the better the profile you can make. Again, doing behavioral analysis that you never maybe considered before. And we have a chief, data analytics officer that's how she lives her whole life. And so, I do anticipate that as we get better with it, we'll introduce, hey, if you like to play craps and you like to go to the day clubs at the pool, that means you want to do a helicopter experience out to the Grand Canyon, because 90% of the people do. And so I think that'll be interesting experiences, because we are building, as I look at the new casino that we're opening up in National Harbor, Maryland, every room has an 8-port switch. And that's because we anticipate that much technology going into the room to personalize the experience in the room, even probably to the point where you can game in your room if you want to. And so I don't think we'll be unique to that experience. Like I said, I think Disney is already 4 years ahead of us in that experience. And so I think you will see much more personalized experiences coming in that space. And yes, the more you give, the more, I don't think it'll be quite the monetary thing, but the more you give me, the better experience I'm going to give you, and people will perceive value in that.
Thanks. So, follow-up question. So, one of the things that stood out about Sam's discussion of strong authentication solutions using the FIDO standards. So, Google's using the same stuff internally that it's now pushing to consumers. So, I've got a FIDO key that I can use to log into my Gmail account, to my Dropbox account, to my GitHub account, but it's the same solution you guys are pushing on both sides. From where you sit, owning both enterprise as well as consumer, are you starting to see a common set of solutions emerge that can handle both enterprise and customer-facing identity, or are you still sort of seeing these in two different stacks?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we're playing with both, because I will say some of the things that are cool about the new consumer-facing technology is more of the API-based thing. So, and I don't mean to beat up on the traditional identity guys, right? But it was always, well, we got all these connectors, and so, just stick the connector in, and, assuming you never customize your app, which everybody does, right? The connector kind of sort of sticks, and, oh, crap, I'm the security guy. How many developers do I have on staff, right? Where an API-based model, I can turn around to the application team and say, if you want to play, here's the API, you figure out how to use it, and I'll certify it, right? And so that's a very powerful experience, because now that we've done more and more single sign-on, now anytime anybody brings on a new app and it's not single sign-on enabled and automatically provisioned and all that, they hate it, right? The users hate it because they want the instant-on experience, they want the single sign-on experience, and so they pressure the development team to interface back into us. That's a very different model, right? It was always the please, please, please come along with me model, and now it's the users pushing back on the application developers saying, why didn't you integrate that?
But you've got consumer-facing services, right? Mm-hmm. So you're playing both worlds. Right. So coming from this is my solution provider's hat. We do business with enterprise. We have like Fortune 50 customers, and those folks are very much in the traditional world of enterprise identity management, right? So the first thing we were asked is for SAML support, and I was like, SAML? Okay, how about OAuth? I'm the new technology person. I come in like, oh, let's do OAuth support. They're like, OAuth, what's that? We don't want it. So I think there's still a wide gap, right, today on enterprise identity management, even though we all know that every employee is a consumer themselves, but the burden of traditional and legacy technologies are still there. So that makes it a little bit challenging.
And Joe, what are you seeing on the SailPoint side?
Well, so I would just add to the standards dialogue, where OAuth and SAML before it have been focused on more of the authentication and single sign-on world. SCIM, the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, is really helping us to make progress. It's been slow, but make progress on having that more rich but standardized interface to turn on these target systems so they can be part of not just sign-on, but full governance. Literally provisioning of all entitlements as you might need, the full range of those attributes and those capabilities, and then to do so in a way that can now be replicated much more quickly. Now that, it still translates to a burden for application development. And so I think that's where we're still stuck upstream with the need to be designing systems and architecting systems and actually coding systems that incorporate these sorts of standards, because we're looking far enough down the deployment scenario, the user experience scenario. Companies are still learning all the implications of their pace of change, their pace of development, and that can make it hard. But standards are emerging to help.
So we've got about 7 minutes left, which is the time that I wanted to open stuff up to you in the audience. So if anybody has a question, if not, I got a few more. I do. Nobody?
Question.
In the corner.
I do have a question.
Just wait for the microphone since this is being webcast as well. And
Thanks. Steve Curtis from Accenture. Just curious, primarily for Mr. Srinivas, in terms of being able to do real-time contextual authentication. Who's setting the policies for that, and how do you go about changing policies across different working teams, maybe in a dynamic basis?
Yeah, we do have essentially a policy group which is managing the access rules and the access management engine. And they came up with a vocabulary of splitting all the applications. We literally have thousands into various categories of sensitivity, and depending on the category of sensitivity, they would ask for a particular level of level of authentication, I guess. So let me give an example. The least sensitive would be you can access it from any device. So we'll actually allow you to access it from any device. The most sensitive would be that we can even go all the way to you can access it only from a managed device, and we can even say it's on our physical premises if we so want. And so we can also say things like when, I think this example came up when an employee is traveling, if then regions we don't particularly want them to have access to sensitive systems, it just happens dynamically because the rule set has those kind of concepts, you know. So when you're accessing, you know the device, you know the time, you know where they're coming from, and of course, you know, strong ID of them. So the quick answer is it's the hardest problem actually, maintaining the madness once you've set it. The mechanism to create the madness is great, but now do you maintain the madness? And so it's basically a dedicated security policy group, and they get control over it by basically making it into a few broad categories.
Just an addition to that, so another thing that we've actually encountered is the opportunity to crowdsource data stewardship. So while it's always been tough, I mean, you could say DLP didn't really happen because of the classification burden and the very difficult time you have in sort of creating from scratch all the classification levels for all your documents and all the scenarios. Well, so we bought a company, Whitebox Security, last year that had this patented capability to crowdsource data stewardship. And in effect, what happens is the users of a file that's shared end up voting on who owns it and who should be setting the controls. And what it does is it starts to enlist the users themselves, the grassroots, in this need to really police ourselves. And there's even a gamification element in it, so that you really are now encouraging with sort of traditional, you know, modern, not traditional, but modern user experience scenarios and behaviors, such that we can really leverage the fact, and that's the only way we're going to get over this, right? We're never going to catch up, arguably, with the full and complete classification of everything we do top down. And that's, you know, if you look at the way technology is being adopted very rapidly these days, more and more of the direction of the experience is being brought down to the interface out of necessity, because that's the only, and we're learning in real time versus consulting a manual on how to use a new device, right? A good web service, a good application will teach you as you go, right? So crowdsourcing is another potential scenario here to improve the stewardship from the bottom up.
Other questions? Microphone's coming.
I was in the California DMV yesterday. They used biometrics 4 times in a very brief office process. When will we see biometrics being more frequently used in point of sale and similar situations as an identification verification?
That actually scares me. Biometrics information, as opposed to, you know, magnetic striped credit card, right? Sure, biometrics information is something that you want to handle with care because it strongly identifies a person, but does not necessarily strongly authenticate a person. There's a difference. The difference is, how do I make sure that the person who's presenting this biometric information is indeed me? There's still another gap. The problem with biometrics today is that the processes that are associated with using this information is, in my opinion, not comprehensive, not robust. Hence, as a privacy person, it really scares me to have that as an authentication mechanism, or at least the only factor.
Although I will say, just to jump in as a moderator for a change, there's a difference between models where you're using a biometric only to unlock the device, where I can use that today with Apple Pay, whereas biometrics in the cloud, where somebody who was a victim of the OPM breach a year ago, and I've got all 10 of my fingerprints sitting somewhere on the other side of the world, it's really 2 different models. And, you know, I think a lot of, you know, what we've been seeing as we look at different approaches, you know, we were talking in the hallway earlier, can I pay by the pool if I'm in the MGM ecosystem? That's one set of risk models. Can I authorize a bank transfer in a much more open ecosystem with remote biometrics? That triggers a whole other set of risks. A lot of the work that, well, actually, Sam, why don't you talk about on the FIDO side?
Yeah, I guess it's. So I was started out saying like the vision would be you tap your phone on something and just show your fingerprint, and so there's a biometric involved there. But in all of these standards, the good thing is the biometric is very local. It stays on your device, and basically, it's the only way it manifests to the outside world is as a signature for a key that's attached to that action. And so even in the Apple Pays of the world and so forth, they're never sending anything to do with the fingerprint off your phone. Your phone is only enabling some standard cryptographic or other operation. And if the person at the other end basically believes that that's good enough, that is, they know that the iPhone does a pretty good job of recognizing a user. I registered a user the first time, and if that thing signs, it means it's likely them. That's what they take. So you do get the convenience of biometrics, but you don't get some of the more nuclear stuff we were just discussing. We really don't want them in the cloud and everywhere. So the point of sale thing might very well be if there's an identity provider. Let's say the DMV identity is now distributed and you can be carried on your phone, and you can present, and someone says, show me your license. I mean, these are thoughts people are already having. You basically tap your phone and press the fingerprint. It's not sending the fingerprint to the DMV, but it's kicking off a process where the DMV is able to verify that you actually representing the key that only you can own, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and two, I think, the concept of that's valuable customer data to my marketing team, it's just not, right? So we've looked at point of sale because that becomes very interesting for us, but we made it for life of the visit. Right? You can register your fingerprints when you check in if that's how you want to pay. It's your opt-in choice. And oh, by the way, when you check out, I'm going to burn them because they're really no value to me anyway. And I'm going to go ahead and take you through the inconvenience of registering them every time because it's really not that hard. I mean, you stick your fingers on it while you're waiting for chip and pin to validate and you're good to go, right? So I think we as practitioners should be thoughtful about the data that we're allowing our guys to store and the data that we're not allowing them to store. You know, it's useful for a time, but I don't need 3 years worth of fingerprints in my marketing database. I just don't.
For privacy, you should practice small data, not big data.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Clear is another opt-in scenario, right? Does anyone use Clear, right? So at the airport, so I've given my fingerprints up, actually thumbprints, because these are a little rubbed down, to authenticate at the airport, and it gets me out of the big long line, right? So that's a convenience trade I'm willing to make, and yet it's in a context where I'm now dramatically reducing the risk of at least me, low-risky traveler, through that system, right? Through a system that's looking at how do we really manage risk effectively. If we can get more people to opt in and figure out how to get people through faster via that mechanism, that becomes an interesting impact on a very important gate in flow. So opt-in measures like this, we're slaves to our convenience and the things that we want, and we're going to make those trades. It's about who can figure out how to do it under the circumstances where we actually feel like it's been a good deal.
So we get the big red light flashing, which means we're out of time and we got to move on to lunch. Any quick closing thoughts from anybody before we go?
Actually, I'd like to pick up on that thought. Essentially, if you want convenience where people are anticipating stuff and so on, you have to share information, right? And so you can choose to either have it or not. So even if you have like this your staff who knows exactly what you're a rich guy and they know exactly what suit to lay out, what your breakfast might be, when you prefer your flights, and how to change your wine, they know a heck of a lot about you. And that's how they're adding the convenience. So basically, this is a very fundamental sort of just a fact, basically. So whoever you share this information with, you have to trust them, and they have to make you earn your trust. And so it's just nice.
Well, it is. Convenience is, I mean, we're all going to opt for convenience at some point, right? But on the flip side, I think because consumer is going to make that choice, it is the solution provider's civic responsibility to really be a good steward of the data, of the information.
Oh, I absolutely agree. In fact, I think you should expect very high standards of anybody, especially who manages your data at scale. So, simple things like you should be able to say, I want out. and basically I delete my account, tell me you're deleting everything, or I want to delete, extract all my data. These are the kind of things we try and do at least. So you can say, we call it take out everything that I got, delete my account, and we try and just wipe out all memory that we have, a few things along these lines. I think I totally agree. It's a responsibility of solution provider to adhere to a very high standard. Yeah.
So if we want to continue this discussion, because we do got to wrap up, table 6 will be the identity table. There'll be a privacy table too that Sean Brooks will be leading. And with that, Jim, are you going to come up and talk about what comes next? Thanks to the panel, Sam, Scott, Chengzi, Joe.